You didn't feel fireworks when it happened. There was no sudden rush of triumph, just a quiet shift in the air. The world looked the same. Streets, faces, routines, but something inside you had stepped out of alignment. That's when you realize it wasn't the world that changed. It was you. Freedom arrives like this, soft, disorienting, almost threatening. Your old identity stops buffering reality, and everything feels exposed, fragile, strangely honest. You notice how many people never leave their cages, not because they're locked in, but because the unknown weighs more than familiar pain. There's a moment after escape where silence gets loud and possibility feels heavier than suffering. You've crossed an invisible line now, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. There is a quiet truth beneath human behavior. Structure gives identity, even painful structure, especially painful structure. When your days are shaped by obligation, struggle, or limitation, the mind adapts. It learns where to stand. It learns what role to play. You become familiar with the boundaries, even if they hurt. That familiarity becomes a form of safety. So when those walls fall away, when you finally leave the job, the relationship, the version of yourself that was built for survival, the mind doesn't celebrate, it destabilizes. Freedom creates a vacuum, and the first thing you feel inside that vacuum isn't possibility, it's absence. The habits that once filled your time vanish. The old pressures that organized your thoughts go silent. Suddenly there's no external force telling you who to be or how to move. And that's when the internal noise begins. Not dramatic, subtle, a low-level unease. A sense that something important is missing, even though nothing is technically wrong. This is the psychological void most people aren't prepared for. They imagine liberation as expansion, but internally, it feels like collapse. You've removed the structure, but you haven't rebuilt the self yet. So you float between versions. The old identity is gone, the new one hasn't formed, and in that in-between space, the nervous system starts looking backward. Not because you miss the suffering, but because you recognize the terrain. Familiarity has gravity. There's a part of you that wants to return, not to pain, to predictability, to the rhythm of what you already know how to endure. The mind would rather inhabit a known cage than an unknown field. This isn't weakness. It's biology. The brain evolved to prioritize certainty over growth, control over expansion, even when certainty is uncomfortable. That's why people sabotage their own escape. They leave something harmful, then recreate it in a different form. They achieve freedom, then fill it with noise, distraction, new dependencies, anything to avoid sitting inside the unstructured quiet long enough for a deeper identity to emerge, because that quiet is confrontational. Without external pressure, you're forced to meet yourself directly. There's no role to perform, no crisis to manage, no system to blame, just your internal landscape, unfinished, unorganized, waiting. This is where romantic ideas about liberation fall apart. Freedom isn't immediately empowering, it's disorienting. It strips away momentum. It exposes how much of your personality was built as a reaction to constraint. When the constraint disappears, so does the version of you that knew how to operate inside it. What remains is raw, untrained, unstructured. This is the internal collapse before reconstruction. And most people never stay here long enough for the reconstruction to happen. They rush to replace the old container with a new one. Another routine, another identity, another external framework to lean against. Not because they're incapable of standing alone, but because standing alone requires patience with emptiness. Real freedom doesn't announce itself. It grows slowly, almost quietly. After you survive this phase, after you stop trying to immediately fill the space, after you let the nervous system recalibrate, after you allow the silence to teach you what actually matters, when nothing is forcing your attention, only then does freedom begin to feel alive. Not as excitement, not as chaos, but as internal alignment, a steadiness that doesn't depend on circumstance, a sense of authorship over your own movement. But that comes later. First comes the void. And if you can sit inside it without running back to familiarity, something subtle starts to rebuild itself from the inside out. A different kind of structure, one that isn't imposed, one that isn't reactive, one that belongs to you. There's no dramatic moment when this happens, no clear milestone, just a gradual realization that you're no longer waiting for permission to exist. The silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling spacious, and you understand quietly that the hardest part of freedom was never leaving. It was staying. Most systems don't restrain the body first. They condition perception. They begin by teaching what gets rewarded and what gets ignored, what earns approval, what creates conflict. Over time, behavior adapts, not because you're weak, but because survival learns quickly. You start choosing predictability over possibility, familiar discomfort over uncertain freedom. The invisible architecture of routine forms around you. Wake, work, distract, repeat. Expectations become internal policies. Fear becomes a quiet advisor. And slowly, identity starts to take shape around what feels safest to maintain. This is why so many limits feel personal. They're not experienced as rules. They're experienced as instincts. You don't feel controlled. You feel practical. You don't feel constrained. You feel realistic. But realism, when inherited, often hides its origins. It arrives dressed as common sense. It tells you what's just how life works. It doesn't shout. It whispers through family patterns, cultural norms, and unspoken permissions. By the time you notice it, it already sounds like your own voice. What's happening beneath the surface is quiet adaptation. The nervous system learns to minimize exposure. The mind learns to avoid friction. Desire is edited before it reaches consciousness. Curiosity becomes selective. Risk is reframed as irresponsibility. And eventually you stop reaching for what feels too far away, not because it's impossible, but because you've learned not to. This is how captivity becomes internal, not imposed violently, but absorbed gradually. Most people imagine limitation as something external. Authority, circumstance, lack of opportunity. But the deeper mechanism is subtler. It lives in what you expect from yourself, in how quickly you abandon an idea, in how often you pre-reject your own impulses. By the time a door appears locked, you've already trained yourself not to test the handle, and this is where the philosophical turn happens. You begin to notice that what you call personality is often just repeated survival. The habits you defend, the patterns you rationalize, the emotional ranges you allow yourself to feel. They weren't chosen freely. They were shaped in response to pressure, social, familial, psychological. Over time, adaptation hardens into identity. You learned when to stay quiet. You learned when ambition creates tension. You learned which parts of yourself receive acceptance and which ones create distance. So you adjusted, not consciously, efficiently. The mind is brilliant at creating coherence out of constraint. It builds stories that make endurance feel intentional. It reframes limitation as character. It tells you that you prefer small spaces, that you're not that kind of person, that this is just who you are. But beneath that narrative is something simpler. You adapted to what was available. Power doesn't always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like shaping expectations so thoroughly that resistance never forms. Control doesn't require force when permission has already been rewritten. Silence becomes self-maintained. Discipline becomes self-policed. And eventually the system doesn't need to hold you in place. You do it yourself. The unsettling part isn't that this happens. It's that it feels normal. Freedom doesn't disappear in dramatic moments. It erodes through repetition, through unexamined routines, through inherited caution, through the quiet agreement to stay within familiar boundaries. And because it happens slowly, it rarely feels like loss. It feels like maturity, responsibility, realism, until one day you notice the distance between who you are and who you might have been. Not with panic, with stillness. That awareness doesn't demand action. It doesn't create noise. It simply settles in. A recognition that your edges were softened over time, that many of your limits were learned, not innate, and that beneath the conditioning, there is a quieter intelligence watching everything unfold, patient, uninjured, waiting. You don't need to break anything to feel it. You just have to notice. And in that noticing, something inside you grows quiet, not empty. You don't notice it at first. The shift arrives quietly, disguised as progress. New rooms, new conversations, new expectations. And somewhere inside that movement, something familiar begins to feel misplaced. The habits that once protected you now slow you down. The stories you used to tell yourself feel thin. You sense it in the pauses between thoughts. A subtle tension, like wearing clothes that no longer fit. This is where most people get confused. They assume growth should feel empowering, but real transformation often begins as disorientation, a quiet unease, a pressure behind the eyes. Because when your environment changes faster than your identity, the mind resists. Not loudly, subtly. It clings. And in that clinging, you start to feel divided. The moment after a breakthrough is rarely celebratory. It's silent. You stand inside a new reality, carrying an old version of yourself that doesn't belong there. Your nervous system still reacts to threats that no longer exist. Your emotional reflexes were trained in smaller rooms. The beliefs that once helped you survive now limit how far you can move. This is identity fragmentation, when your external world expands but your internal architecture stays the same. You feel it as fatigue without cause, irritation without direction, a strange grief that doesn't have a clear story. People often mistake this phase for failure. They think something is wrong because they don't feel settled. But what's actually happening is quieter, deeper. Your psyche is renegotiating its shape. The mind is conservative by nature. It protects continuity. It prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar freedom. So when you step into a larger environment, more responsibility, more visibility, more possibility, the old self tries to come with you. It insists on keeping its roles, its defenses, its emotional patterns. And that creates friction. There is a cost here that no one talks about. Not dramatic loss, subtle loss. You begin shedding versions of yourself that once felt essential. The identity built around proving. The comfort of being underestimated. The emotional armor that made sense when you were smaller. Even certain relationships start to feel out of alignment. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because you are no longer operating at the same frequency. This is the quiet grief of evolution. You don't mourn a single moment. You mourn a whole era of who you were. And this is where many people turn back, not because they can't move forward, but because moving forward demands separation from old narratives, old coping strategies, old emotional shortcuts, from the familiar weight of being who you used to be. Staying feels easier. Regression feels safer. You tell yourself you're being practical, but beneath that logic is a simpler truth. Not everyone is willing to pay the psychological price of becoming. Power doesn't announce itself in this phase. It withdraws. It becomes internal. You stop explaining your changes. You stop trying to carry your past self into a future it cannot survive. You begin to notice how often your reactions are echoes from an earlier life, how certain fears are outdated, how some of your emotional responses belong to a version of you that no longer exists. This is not about self-improvement. It's about self-replacement. The new world you've entered doesn't need your old strategies. It doesn't respond to your previous survival mechanisms. It requires a different posture, a quieter confidence, a deeper restraint. You start to understand that identity isn't fixed, it's adaptive. It evolves under pressure. And when you resist that evolution, you experience it as anxiety. When you allow it, you experience it as clarity. There is a moment, subtle but irreversible, when you realize you can't go back, not because the past was bad, but because you no longer fit inside it. You've outgrown certain fears, certain ambitions, certain versions of connection. You begin to move differently, speak less, observe more. You stop chasing validation from rooms you've already left, and in that stillness, something settles. You don't feel triumphant. You feel aligned. You understand that becoming someone new is not an act of force. It's an act of release. You let go of identities that carried you through smaller worlds. You allow the silence that comes after shedding. You accept that freedom always costs something, and maturity is simply the willingness to pay it, not loudly, not publicly, just internally. And from there you move forward, quieter, lighter, and finally intact. It always happens at the same point. Possibility appears before certainty does. You finally see how things work, how identity is constructed, how attention is traded for comfort, how most lives are built on repetition rather than intention. For a brief moment, there's clarity, a sense of separation from the old rhythm. But then something subtle shifts. The external pressure disappears. No one is chasing you anymore. No crisis is forcing movement. And that's when people retreat. Not because they can't change, but because change no longer has a villain to fight. Awakening feels powerful at first. Then it becomes quiet. And quiet is uncomfortable when you've spent your life responding to noise. What replaces motivation is responsibility, not the visible kind, the internal kind. The realization that staying awake requires restraint when no one is watching. That freedom isn't maintained through intensity, but through consistency. There's no applause for that. No visible milestones. Just small, private decisions, repeated without witnesses. Most people don't turn back because they fail. They turn back because they succeed just enough to lose their excuses. The old narratives collapse. The external obstacles fade. And suddenly everything depends on internal structure. That's where the momentum breaks. You start to see it in people's eyes. They touch clarity, then soften. They glimpse possibility, then return to familiar patterns. Not out of weakness, out of relief, because responsibility is heavier than struggle. Struggle gives you something to blame. Responsibility gives you nothing. It hands you time. It hands you choice. It removes the drama and leaves only discipline. And discipline, when stripped of urgency, feels hollow at first. There's no emotional reward, just alignment, just silence, just the slow realization that no one is coming to carry this for you. Internal evolution doesn't feel like progress. It feels like subtraction. Old reactions fall away. Old identities loosen. You stop performing your growth. You stop explaining yourself. The need to be seen dissolves. And that's when it becomes dangerous. Because without external validation, the mind looks for comfort. It starts negotiating with familiarity. It tells you you've done enough, that you've already changed, that you deserve rest inside the old habits. This is the moment most people call balance, but it's usually retreat disguised as maturity. The hardest part was never breaking out. Breaking out happens during pain, chaos, or crisis. That part is loud. The real difficulty is remaining uncontained when life becomes calm again, when routines return, when nobody's measuring your progress, when discipline becomes invisible. Staying free requires ongoing restraint. It asks you to carry awareness into ordinary days, into quiet evening, into moments where no one would notice if you slipped back. That's where character lives, not in intensity, but in what you preserve when there's nothing forcing you to. Power doesn't announce itself. It stabilizes. It becomes subtle. You stop chasing meaning and start maintaining clarity. You stop reacting and start observing. There's less urgency in your voice, less explanation in your movements. You realize that most people aren't trapped by circumstances. They're released. They're released by insight, and then recaptured by comfort. They turn back right here at the edge of their own autonomy, because freedom requires structure, and structure requires self-respect and silence. And eventually, if you stay, something settles. Not confidence, not pride, stillness. A quiet alignment between who you are and how you move through the world. No performance, no audience, just presence. The kind that doesn't need to be proven. The kind that remains intact, even when nothing is happening. That's when you understand. The door was never locked. Most people simply didn't want to carry what was waiting on the other side.